So if you don't know who Sam is yet, well, I don't know exactly what you've been doing with your life. This is now his third appearance on the Lunch on the Way podcast, and he has the record for the #1 and #2 most downloaded episodes on the podcast. So here's a little bit of a summary as to who Sam is in case you don't know. We're bringing him back for a third time. He's recently moved from New Zealand to Sydney, Australia to take up a position at the Christian Education National as Director of Professional Learning. And you're on the executive team, which is pretty intense when I saw on the website, which means he helps educators in the Christian space think well about education, and he draws on his cultural observational learning. So welcome, Sam. And was that information actually correct?
It's so funny because it's true, but you guys know me better than that as well. So it's just awkward watching your reactions to that sort of information. So, but thank you, Joey, for making me sound really good.
Oh, dear.
Joey's never been so prepared. Oh, it's awesome.
Yeah, this is respect. This is what happens when you move away. You get respect.
You say you haven't been respected by us and before. Is that what it is, Sam?
I mean, last time didn't we spend like half an hour talking about my hair? Anyway, this is why I just had a haircut.
We did. So we were like, what are we going to talk about, Sam? This is your third time on, and you presented a topic that you actually are talking about within what you're doing. So can you actually explain before we get to the topic, what do you actually do as a job? Like what do you do now? I know I just said the title, but that doesn't really mean a whole lot to me. What do you do?
Yeah, so I kind of got two aspects to it. So as part of my job, I'm lecturing at the National Institute for Christian Education, which is like the tertiary wing of CEN. So still teaching like worldview subjects and biblical foundations, stuff like that. But most of my time is doing the professional learning work. And if I had to put it really simply, I'd probably just say I am doing a bunch of thinking on behalf of the teachers that don't have time to do that thinking. So thinking about pedagogy, like educational philosophy a little bit, theology and culture, and how those things kind of bump into each other and create new problems and opportunities, and just trying to identify some of that. And yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but still figuring out what the job really is at this point.
So you're the person when the kids don't have to go to school who comes to the school and educates the teachers on things.
Pretty much, yeah.
Nice.
And conferences and things like that. And sometimes I'll write things and yeah, all that kind of work.
Nice. Professional development stuff. That's great. You're the reason why I loved once every quarter a Friday off of school.
I'm happy to be that guy for you, Joey.
Yeah, right on. So let's just get into it. The topic we want to talk about today is broadly around this meta crisis in education that you are lecturing or talking and bringing people through, and also how technology with young people is kind of shaping that, and also how there's a meaning crisis within the modern West. Because the last episode we had you in on, you talked about how there was this intellectual curiosity around Christianity once again, because of how, I guess, this new atheist movement was forgetting about the meaning within religion and within, I guess, religious thinking, and how people actually need that, where you can't just be a postmodern person deconstructing everything right down to its core and hoping to live a coherent, meaningful life. So that's kind of where we left off. So I feel like that ties into this.
Definitely, yeah.
So what is this education meta crisis going on, and how does it relate with what I just talked about?
Well, I think, what we said last time was that postmodernity still very much around. Like, I wouldn't argue that we've moved out of like a largely postmodern way of constructing meaning, but I think what's happening is we're seeing little schisms or cracks in that, in the form of people grasping for something that feels a little bit more like solid ground. And so those are the sort of the new things coming through, and you see that in the public intellectual space. But interestingly, I think the place where it's happening most is with young people. And I don't know whether it's a generational thing, you critique those that have come before, but a lot of the Gen Z young students are sort of looking at how millennials have set things up and thought, you guys have sort of missed it a little bit, and critiquing that. And this is why you get a bunch of them not turning to like progressive ideology or kind of like progressive thinking per se, but actually being quite enamored with the opposite, and enamored by sometimes some hard right ideology and some hard right thinking and some radical conservatism. So you get people like Andrew Tate becoming really popular, who are kind of driving this hyper masculine, almost neo-stoic idea of what it means to be a man, which sort of dominates women, and it's quite toxic. But they're turning to these things because at least they feel a bit more solid and a bit like they're saying something meaningful in what feels like quite a nebulous time period. So I don't know if that sets the conversation up, but that's sort of what people are noticing. And if that discipleship is happening mainly through the internet, what it means is formation is happening primarily there. And the argument is that instead of having culture passed down from an adult to a younger person by very human interactions, you're now getting algorithmically directed human development, where young people are getting radicalized and are getting sort of taken to all bunch of different places. And so the meta crisis means we've maybe lost a little bit of what makes education really important in the classroom space between real human beings. And really we need to rediscover what education is. So this isn't necessarily a Christian problem. It's a society problem of making sure that we're teaching people to use freedom well, I think.
I noticed in there that the implication here is obviously digital media. That's what you're referring to. And you talk about the classroom. What do you mean? What are you referring to the classroom? You can't get rid of it, but what's the interface there?
Yeah. So I mean the research is basically showing, and this wouldn't be a surprise to anyone, that kids are spending massive amounts of hours on their phones. And so I think before COVID, they were spending an average of about 6.5 hours a day on their phone outside of constructive work, like homework and things like that, and research. It was just like entertainment purposes. And if that's the case, then most of their interactions and learning about culture is happening through their screen rather than through face-to-face interactions. So there's a thinker called Zachary Stein that I've been reading a little bit, who argues we have our children have nowhere else to be educated but within the cultures we create. And so we've got to be really careful about the cultures we create. But if that's primarily happening through these often quite polemic areas of discourse on the internet, then they're actually being formed into those sorts of ways of thinking. And there's some pretty out there examples of young people, being incentivized by algorithms to get really, really radicalized. And that's a bit worrying.
I definitely sympathize with what you brought up about young people, let's say Generation Z, for it as a broad category, are sympathizing with rebelling through being actually drawn into more conservative type movements online. I don't want to be as particular as I don't want to be particular and name this person I'm thinking of, but I know somebody who, and they're younger, let's say 19, I think they are now, who they're clearly rebelling through the comedians that they listen to online, and also even the language that they use is they're purposefully using certain language to describe things, and I don't want to use the language because I don't want to say it, that I would cringe, and I'd be like, why are you saying that? Like, that's not, you shouldn't say that. And I don't consider myself a progressive or even like somebody who cringes at people using certain types of language, but I even cringed at this, and they're using it to get a reaction. So it's almost like they're drawn into this subculture online of being rebellious in a way that millennials like myself would find cancelable.
Yeah, totally. And so again, from that same book, the quote goes something like, there's different forms of neo-reactionary, conservative, and identitarian or alt-right movements are the ones that have actually stolen the momentum. So it's not so much the progressive rhetoric that has the momentum now. It's trolling, essentially, and it's how can I be transgressive as a way of exercising my freedom of speech?
But a part of me is like, why are you doing that? Because I'm like, I get it, because every younger generation wants to rebel against the generation that preceded them. Like, if millennials were so incredibly progressive and woke, if that's a way of categorizing us, then the way to not be them, which is who wants to be the people who are older than you, is to be the opposite of that. I do understand that on one level. That's like every single generation since, like, I guess the teen revolution in the 60s or whatever. But what does that have to do with meaning? Like, is there a type of seeking after meaning because there's a lack of meaning within that? And because it seems like that general philosophy of being rebellious through trolling, in a sense, is like, I'm trying. It's almost like I'm applying what a meaningless existence is, because I'm not actually attaching myself to a movement per se. I'm attaching myself to almost like a meme of culture.
Yeah, well, I think it basically exists mostly in a critique. So it's seeing the hollowness of some of those arguments and just trolling them and sort of poking fun at them. So you shouldn't. I mean, I guess you could see it as an expression of nihilism or something like that. But really, it's saying these are empty, and I'm going to treat them as if they're empty. And so I guess what it means for meaning is I think that the term solid ground is probably what I would describe as what people are looking for, is something that feels less vacuous than that. And sometimes the critiques feel a bit more in that vein. But we can get into that more if you want. I feel like Jonathan, it's time for him to say something.
No, Jonathan is
I'm
just
still
like, he's like an elastic band. He's just winding up,
just
and he's
stretch
gonna
me out, man. Yeah,
In a-
I'm just
in about 5 minutes, he's gonna come up with a question that just kind of derails this whole thing.
Oh,
I'm not.
every time.
I'm not. I'm really not.
No. So just to add, I'm just have thoughts, and I think we're just kind of laying the foundation to really go a bit deeper here. But I think if I'm thinking rightly within this meta crisis, if you will, of education, is we, as people who are, 35 or 30 years old plus, up to maybe 55, have created an educational model that is deeply postmodern, where it critiques everything and almost like cuts off from the legs even the basis for education itself. And
Okay. Yeah,
I
totally.
feel like that's what's happened. And then we have created a generation of young people who are then educated under this model of being critical of everything and questioning everything, to where they have nothing to stand on when they're actually outside of the educational model in the quote unquote real world. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think what's happened is, because of that, no one can agree what education is actually for. So this is what we mean by the educational meta crisis, is that you've got lots of people who have strong ideas about education, but nothing they can really agree on in terms of what are we actually here to do broadly. Like the ancient Greeks, for example, very clear idea of what education was for. It's training you in the ways of how to use your freedom so that you can engage in civic participation responsibly, and so that the cultural production part of society keeps going in a viable way. We can keep sustaining, maintaining, and creating cultures that produce good people, to use crude language. But now there's no unified idea of what education is for. And so in that mix, you've got people basically going down sometimes quite an ideological route of maybe we just need students to be able to critique power structures, for example. But another one is like, well, if education is, if we can make the point of it up, then maybe we can instrumentalize it for just the economy, or we can instrumentalize it so that kids can become good technicians and coders. So those are another way of, we can just fill in the gap there. But I mean, broadly speaking, if we lose this idea that education is for culture building, then actually we're presented with quite big problems around anything we talk about that meaning, education being meaningful. So I'd say that the meta crisis has three elements to it. So it's epistemic. So we're no longer able to agree on how do we know. It's educational. We're no longer able to agree on how we make sense of the world. And it's spiritual as well. We no longer agree on how we find meaning. So those three things are really pushing on education, saying, how do we know? How do I make sense of the world? How do I find meaning? And people are struggling to have answers to that. And because that's basically people are struggling to find answers to that, It just means it creates this big vacuum in which people can then push their own ideas about what the classroom is for. And so in that space, and this could be a bit of a tangent, but I think it's a useful one, you got the dawn of AI, and basically, this might be a bit rude, but technocrats, people who have something to gain from AI, people who are building apps and programs, basically saying AI is the future. Teachers are stressed. Let us enter in our AI tools to lessen some of the load here. But no one's slowing down to think, hey, this actually changes the very nature of education itself. Let's stop and think about that and maybe maintain this very human passing on of culture, because this is what's the gap. And so I'm very cautious to allow more technology to enter into the mediation space between humans. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh man, you.
Well, I mean, that the assumption sitting underneath that, correct me if I'm wrong, is that technology is amoral.
Exactly. It's a neutral tool, which is very naive.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, you know all about that, Graham. I don't know if you want
Yeah.
to talk about McLuhan or anything like that.
Oh, well, not today, but more ask you the question. So, yeah.
No, I think you laid a really good foundation there. And can you? I just want to, because you went through three big pillars that are really important. So, epistemic, educational, spiritual. So, epistemic is we can't agree on a common thing. Educational is we have no vision for what this is actually for.
Yeah, or how we make sense of the world. So you can see a teacher being like, the educational process is, we've got this world and I've got these humans in the class. I'm supposed to help them make sense of this world, but now I can't figure out how I'm supposed to do that. So that's a crisis of, it's a big problem.
Yeah, and then the spiritual, where there's a lack of meaning, all wrapped in within
How do you make this whole process and this being alive thing meaningful to you? Well,
yeah,
that seems to be a bit of a gap thing too.
Man, okay, you laid a good foundation there. Jonathan.
I was just going to say, I mean, I don't have any big questions here. I'm just asking, what's your intuition? How do we move forward from this then, man? Like, what's your answer to it? Or how do you start to answer it? How are you starting to answer it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think, I work in Christian spaces, and often we can talk about this in quite spiritual terms of, it's us against culture. But I really don't think it is. I think this is a big question that everybody's having to answer, and everybody's feeling in different ways. And even just politically, I think people are feeling it. So to me, it's not so much something new. It's more like something old being rediscovered, which is let's get back to what we're here to do, and really talk about it in quite simple terms. Honestly, educational policy and educational language, people just waffle and they use all this terminology, and half the time you're like, am I dumb or is this really stupid? And most of the time it's just really simple, but dressed up. And so really what we're doing is helping young people to make sense of being alive and give them a sense of purpose in this world. This is what you're here to do. And so there's kind of like a bit of a spectrum that can occur within that, that in both ends of the spectrum often collapse into themselves. So and I'm building this from a guy called Nigel Tubbs, who I've spoken to a little bit. And he basically says in education, it's largely modern liberal arts. So liberal arts meaning there's a freedom element to education and a discipline element to education. So the liberal being the freedom and the arts being what you sit under, the discipline. What some educational policies will do, or some educational practices will say it's all about freedom. It's all about the student expressing what they want to learn, expressing themselves, discovering and driving their own learning. Because we want them, and the word being used here is we want them to be engaged, because they're not engaged. And so maybe if they choose all their own learning, they'll be engaged. So that's freedom. Then the arts side would say, hey, look, there's actually some really important things for you to learn, maybe some texts that you need to get your head around, or discussions or great conversations you need to be aware of so that you can contribute well to the great conversation that's been going on. What tends to happen in educational policy and like the trends that we go back and forth on is for 10 years, governments might be like, it's all student-driven learning. And then they might flick and be like, no, it's classical education. We need to teach them the great texts. And they'll collapse into that one. And really, I think what we're forced to do, I think now, is to say there are some big conversations that have been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years that we do need to be aware of for you to contribute to that well. But at the same time, you need to be able to bring yourself as you are to that learning to do it honestly. And so I find that basically people like to collapse into one or the other depending on what they see the enemy as being. So often in Christian schools, you get this feeling of we don't want to be postmodern, we don't want to be progressive, we don't want to just be student driven because we believe in something. And so what we'll do is we'll construct our schools to sort of mirror classical education. But if you're just saying to kids, these are the things you have to know because this is the good thing to know, and they're not allowed to bring their questions and doubts and wrestling to it, you're probably not doing education at that point. You're probably doing, just the discipline part. But the education happens.
Indoctrination?
Well, I mean, I might stay away from that kind of language, but
Just
the
kidding.
education happens in the wrestle between the two without collapsing. And so that's the conversation I'm having is rediscovering some structural language, some discipline language, but at the same time pushing back on stuff that people want to turn it all into that. Just saying, let's teach them the right stuff. It's like, no, let's get them to interact with the right stuff and wrestle with this and not, get them to agree with you straight away. There you go. I've just blabbed for a long time.
You made a comment before, everybody. I just wondered what everybody was. I could assume that you were talking that the everybody this is predominantly Anglophone Western culture. Is that the everybody?
Yeah,
because
right.
I would think that if you lived, I mean, that's in the geopolitic arena, the high level of now what we're seeing in terms of your, dictatorial, totalitarian type state. I mean, that's their argument back. The West is falling apart. It has no narrative. It's all over the place. So this becomes which I guess pushes the right, that far right ideology of the only way forward here is to find one dominant person or leader or ideology, and we all bow to that. Am I on the right track?
Yeah. Sorry, I should have said that what we're talking about here is really the West. We're probably talking about Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, and maybe some parts of the UK. I think the countries that are sort of very much moving together in the web connects us, and our governments connect us a little bit too. But we're having the same discussions, and I think the internet has brought us together in a new way in that.
And along those lines, I mean, I recently watched a podcast or an interview on YouTube. I sent it to Jonathan and Joey. Her name is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's a African.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Yep, you've got a pronunciation right. I got it. And I was sort of struck by her story about her, in one way, kind of this pragmatism of being atheist that turns now towards the Christian story as being the most logical and practical step forward. And then she also has this other side on a personal level where she had a personal crisis.
Yeah.
And would appear to have come to faith. Now, those are two kind of different angles on that. I don't know if you care to comment on that.
Well, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is someone I've followed for a number of years now, and her story is fascinating. So she escaped Somalia and some pretty bad stuff that was going on there. Became a Dutch politician, and was very much in line with the new atheist movement at one point. And now she's just released that article saying, "Oh, I'm now a Christian because I realized that it's essential to not only uphold Western ideas, but also nothing satisfied me in the meaning space with atheism. The only thing that could seem to do that is Christianity," which is very similar to something that Julian Barnes said at the beginning of his novel, like, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him." And I think this is just another example of someone else who's, turning towards Christianity as, oh, maybe there is a little bit of depth here. And it's interesting seeing Joe Rogan maybe a month ago, literally saying on his podcast, "I think we need Jesus to come back now. We need Jesus." And he wasn't joking around. He was like, if Jesus could come back now, that'd be great. And talking about how atheism seems really hollow. And you're just like, man, this wouldn't have happened 10 or 15 years ago. There's a big shift. People are feeling the vacuum and wanting something substantial to hold on to now, and they're maybe considering that the gospel might have something after all. So the attitude, not necessarily the thinking, but the attitude has changed.
That would seem at the what do you call it, intellectual elites, your Tom Hollands, and there is a variety of them who are included. There seems to be a kind of shift that way, doesn't there? I mean, then I even saw on Brand, what was Russell Brand, baptized? What's that about?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so this is sort of picks up a little bit of what you're really saying here, isn't it? This sort of vacuous, postmodern nothingness. If cultural intellectuals like them are picking that up, then that kind of signifies something, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does signify something. I mean, I'll actually just read you this quote, which I found very interesting. See if I can find it. This is by a guy called Daniel Gortz. So, all of us in academia, we would know, like, post-modernity has been something feared for a little while. But this is what he says. He says, it's not a stretch to claim that the postmodern critique has reached an impasse as an academic project. The postmodern intellectuals have retreated into the ivory towers of academia, decoupling themselves from leadership and the creative reorganizations of society's institutions that are direly needed. The postmodern stance of perpetual questioning simply does not allow for hope, sincerity, and belief, as these are always taken to be new forms of oppression in disguise. Now, that is super interesting that he's identified that. And I think, we've talked about metamodernism a little bit, and I think these ideas of hope, sincerity, and belief are what people are now sort of looking for in different ways. So it's, really interesting to hear these commentators sort of identify that stuff and say this isn't just sort of our imagination. Now, the thing that I guess the tension I have is you can sort of frame this as all good news for a Christian or a Christian institution. You're like, yeah, we're winning. But, the danger here is our schools could become nice little enclaves for some alt-right thinking and neoconservative thought that is dangerous. And you actually want to hold on to the God of grace in this and to say, if God is a person to get to know, then it's different from just being something which upholds your idea of what order looks like. And so this is something that I'm making sure I keep the conversation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting comment you make there. Sorry, Jonathan, were you going to say something?
No, you go, yeah.
Because I've just, and again, watching geopolitics, and I noticed that I think it was a couple of months ago, there was a conservative forum in Europe where it was a meeting of conservative political leaders. But what was interesting is the kind of people that had turned up to that. Now, there was two of them. There was something else. I can't remember the names of both of them, but there were significant events. Now, and what you get there is a mix of your kind of right, and then there's a mix of Christianity sitting in that too. It's really very difficult to read. I'm trying to read that, and I'm going, so yeah, so it's confusing. I find it a little confusing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. It presents new. I mean, like I said last time, this is why you got massive queues to get into Christian schools. It presents great new opportunities, but some challenges as well, for sure.
With the queues to go into Christian schools, I think within broader culture, if this vacuum of meaning and this vacuum of what actually is education and what's the vision and goal of education, if that vacuum is felt even just by the average person who's secular, who is not affiliated with any formal or institutional religion, but they're like, they're a person in the West, they would be going to Christian schools or wanting to send their children to Christian schools because there is a perceived, I guess, compass within that institution or foundation with which it's built upon. Whereas
they'll use words like common sense or good values.
Yes, there we are. Yeah, common sense or good values or not crazy is another one that gets thrown around online a little bit. And that's because this is obviously a broad paint of a sweeping generalization. But within, it seems like the average state school, just typical public school system, it's like what is the vision and what is the goal and what is the purpose? It feels a little bit disjointed where there's competing narratives going on within what actually is the outcome of education. And at least within the Christian space, there's no mystery as to what the outcome of the education is, at the moment at least.
Is
It
there
seems relatively clear. I don't know, push back on that. That's just the perception by the people who I know who send their kids to Christian schools, you know?
I don't know, Sam. What's the vision of a Christian school? I mean, does a Christian school know what education's for?
I would love. Can you unpack your thinking there a little bit? Because I think you and I
Yeah.
are probably on the same page there, John.
Oh, who, me? No, I'm just picking up on what Joey says, that maybe the secular schools, there's a clash of ideologies and they're not sure what education is. But I'm just wondering, I don't think Christians stand in any kind of, they're not, disconnected from that clash of ideologies. And I'm just wondering, do Christian schools know what education is? Could they articulate what education is for? Because it seems to me that, not knowing Christian schools, but Christianity's like tacked on to STEM subjects just as whatever, like indigenous kind of spiritualities are tacked onto STEM subjects inside of secular schools. There seems to be, in my mind, they're flip sides of the same coin. The meaning crisis isn't just in education; it's the whole of the world at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And
Would that be right?
Education's like the thermometer, I think, sometimes for a much broader thing.
And then I wonder if are we after a Christianity, or are we just after a nostalgia? And people like Russell Brand, all that. I mean, I don't know where they're at, but it seems like a calling for a nostalgia. Just nostalgia back to some kind of solid ground.
Yeah, I mean, nostalgia is always a twisting of the past, isn't it? It's not even the real past.
That's right.
Yeah.
What's your feeling of Christian schools? What's their understanding of education?
Well, you're putting me in an awkward position because
I am, that's not fair. Yeah.
Yeah, what can you say? You can't say that.
Yeah.
I would say that, people have thought about this to greater and lesser degrees. So I'd say some schools, what they mean by this is we teach from a Christian worldview. So that means when we do speak ideologically or about meaning, what we're doing is explicitly drawing that from the Bible. And that's great.
Yeah.
I find that Christian schools or institutions can be very good at talking about leadership, can be very good at talking about morality, and be very good at talking about worldview studies.
Yeah.
But then when you ask the question of like, okay, but what's Christian about the way you're teaching this algorithm to this child in front of you? That becomes a very different conversation. So I think I'll start, and maybe someone can jump in. But when it comes to what do we mean by Christian education, you've got to be really careful around. We don't just want to fill our students' brains with what we deem to be the right ideas. That's not what it is. That sort of buys into a very cerebral or cognitive idea of if we give them the right ideas, we'll be all right. James K. Smith has a great quote where he's just like, if that's what we think Christian education is, you're blind to the idea that, most of what goes on is actually not in the brain, it's in the heart, it's in the desires. And so, for instance, if you're talking about a Christian sexual ethic and you think you've done your job by telling kids this is what you can and can't do, what you've effectively done is poured water on the head to put out a fire in the heart. And so I'm, really keen for it not to be like Christian seasoning or like the icing on top. You want the whole thing to be, what are we doing here? And to get really big and broad just for a second, Christianity or the gospel, what we're really saying is something has happened in space-time. God has revealed himself in a man, and then death has been broken. Resurrection has happened in space-time. This is not like an ethic. This is something that happened. We now have to deal with it. And if it's true that this God man has if we're arguing that in this God man all things hold together and he is uniting all things to himself, then when you discover knowledge, you're now being pulled into a dialogue rather than just like discovering things on a neutral rock that's circling the sun. You're actually discovering echoes of him, which changes the very basis of what it means to know. So I'm interested in starting from that point. We're not trying to make humans first and foremost that behave the right way and believe the right things, but have got this vision of what reality actually is, and then everything stems from that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what I want to clear up, and I think what you said is exactly right. What I want to do is broaden this definition of Christian education. Like, we're not just, we were initially talking about, primary through, year 13 or whatever, and then into university a little bit. Yeah, sure. But Christian education in the most broad sense is discipleship in a sense. But so when I, at least I'm hearing you when it comes to Christian education, and if we think about Christian education as just a cognitive thing and not a heart desire thing, as James K. Smith says, then it actually impacts how do you communicate and how do you instruct within your churches, within your families, within every single sphere of an institution in life, not just in that formal 9 to 3 Christian school education. Yeah, it's a much bigger project, it seems like to me.
It's a great place to start, Sam. Man.
Yeah, I think
Because
this
it
this
changes
is
the rules of the game. Because I feel like Christian education tends to do, just plays the same rules. Like it's like, yeah, we'll just tag along behind and try to do our best. But what you're doing seems to me is saying the rules are completely different now.
That's right.
The
Yeah.
game is completely changed.
I think
Yeah.
there's maybe sometimes you can detect a bit of an underdog mentality of like,
Yeah.
we're a Christian school, but we can bat with the big boys,
Yeah,
and so we can be about excellence. And you're like, no, that's really good. We definitely should be about excellence, but
Yeah.
that shouldn't be kind of like the driving virtue or the overarching category. It should be, no, we're actually here to do something else that should lead us to excellence. But
Yeah.
primarily, that's not what we're doing. And in some ways, I mean, again, to quote Smith, he's like, we should be making people that are disruptive for society and not necessarily really good at it. So using their imaginations to, in some ways, not play the game and to actually disrupt the game. Yeah.
That's awesome, because I was going to ask you, okay, so what's a student that leaves a Christian school look like? Like what are we looking for? What kind of student are we looking to graduate at the end of their education? What kind of student? What would be the ideal student? And one of them perhaps would be disruptive in the best possible sense, like a disruptor that could bring kind of new ways of looking at the world, or hope in hopeless situations, that kind of disruption, right?
Yeah,
Have you thought of what else are we looking for in a student? I feel like this is a job interview. I'm so sorry, man.
no, this is good. If I can't articulate this, then in some ways, what am I doing?
Right.
But I think I like that you've looked for words. I think some in the past I've thought, oh man, if I had to identify what the school wanted as for their graduates,
Yeah,
I'd probably,
graduate profile. What's a graduate
yeah,
profile? Yeah, that's the word. Yeah.
yeah, I'd probably say, oh, they're wanting kids that are submissive, compliant, and nice. And
Yeah.
I would love to go beyond that. So disruptive, totally. But I think hopefully disruptive. So
Yes.
I mean, this is where I draw quite a lot on Moltmann, the theologian. I sort of think, the way he defines hope is really really awesome. He's sort of like he defines it as people that have a passion for the possible.
That's
So
good.
you're looking at the world and you're thinking, oh, I see what it is, but I know what else it could be. And he defines the church as people of hope as being a constant disturbance in society, and of like, yep, we've got systems that work, they're pretty good, and a lot of people want to stop there and be like, yeah, okay, let's just chill. And the church is like, yeah, but it doesn't work for everybody, and it doesn't reflect a world in which Christ is Lord completely. So if that's the case, I'm going to be a niggly little presence, this constant disturbance to say, yeah, but we've still got work to do. And so hope is very much an active source within the church. And yeah, I think that's a big one for graduates. And so one of the things I encourage for teachers is we should be giving students opportunities to challenge authority. And that means you. So, are you giving them chances to practice what it means to see even the classroom practice in light of its future possibilities? Well, I hope so, because they're going to need that when they go into the workplaces and stuff where they need to do that challenging work too, and not be rude and belligerent and make people offside. And also just like using their imaginations is another big one too. And you might set an assignment and they reimagine, I could do it like this. And instead of saying, maybe stick to the rules and be like, oh no, that's brilliant. Can we somehow harness that energy? So
So
Can I come
that's
back and do
great.
schooling with you? That sounds epic.
I know, Jonathan, you might have to go for school
Yeah, I've got to
pickup or
go. I've got to
something.
go.
All good. But
See, I'm just warming up. Now I'm getting into it. Yeah.
I know exactly. It takes you a while just to kind of get into this.
really good to
isn't it?
see you, man.
Yeah, so good to see you, man. Far out. Let's do
Have
this
another
again
chat
soon.
soon. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. All
All
right,
right.
fellas.
See ya.
I hope. Yep.
So to continue on with what you just said, and I think Graham's going to pop back in a second. We're dropping like flies at this point in the conversation, which is fine, and we'll wrap things up. But so you just said it would be good for people to push back as students to practice that kind of hopeful disruptiveness, and how would you say that is different to the postmodern, if you will, what do you call it? Not progressive, but social justice type person who needs to deconstruct everything and overturn all authority structures within society. How is that different?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I do not want to sound like I'm just pushing against power structures for the heck of it. I think what I always want to do is frame that in light of hope. So again, to use Maltman, just because he's my boy, he would describe hope as proleptic, which means essentially that what we're doing when we're active in hope is pulling something from the future into the present. And we're not just saying, I don't like power structures, let me have my freedom. We're saying we've already got a kind of a sneak preview in very vague terms about what it's going to look like at the very end, when all things are made right. There'll be no more sickness, no more crying, no more pain, no more death. And it can be very easy then to look at the systems and say, oh, this is actually, this doesn't reflect that vision. So you're always building out of this vision of where things are going. So you're always in light of the last chapter. And so you're not criticizing structure for the sake of it. You're saying, actually, I've been filled with a vision from scripture, from what Jesus is doing, and uniting all things to himself, not just uniting everything, but uniting it to him. And so therefore, we can't go down that route. It can't be. And this is difficult for us, because at no point are we removed from those structures. They always implicate us. And so, if we're going to criticize some capitalistic models, which are kind of easy to do, we're implicated in that, which means I'm not allowed to practice using my money and my purchasing decisions in the same way. Christ is Lord over that too. And that's really uncomfortable. So it's never just I am let off the hook here and I get to criticize other people. It's I'm implicated in this same thing myself. So deeply uncomfortable stuff from Jesus.
I do like how you answer that question, because my initial thoughts were wrong, how I would have answered it. I would have answered it, well, yeah, look to the future vision, but also hold on to the past and kind of merge the two, which sounds right. And it is in a sense right. But when you said no, always stay united to the vision of Jesus, and not only who he is, but the vision in the world he instantiated through himself and his crucifixion and resurrection. That's a lot better, because what could happen is where you see some of these academics or people in broader society wanting to latch onto Christianity because of its principles rooted in the past for a future that is nostalgically reliving the past, which is very different to what you just described.
I think the past comes from looking at the faithfulness of God through our history. And so that means that my hope is not in vain, because I've seen all through history, he's done what he said he's going to do. And so, yes, I stand in the past, but looking forward.
Yeah. Excellent. So I think let's end there, and let's actually pivot now to what are you doing? What are you doing? What's happening in the next, week or two? What's coming up around the horizon?
My birthday? No, it's not.
Oh, okay.
But I do still expect a present for what I'm just about to say. So yeah, I've resisted this for a long time, but then it became part of my job description. I've been asked to start a podcast. And I was like, oh, there's so many youngish guys running podcasts, and I don't want to add to the noise. So the way I got around this was by just basically getting hold of some of the best thinkers in the entire world and getting them to talk, and I'll just ask them questions. So I I think by the time that this episode airs, it'll be out there. So the podcast is called Makerspace. So Makerspace. And it's a educational term, which is about collaboration and problem solving, but it's also a play on words of the Kuyperian quote of "There's not a square inch of all creation that Christ does not declare mine." It's the maker's space. And so the idea is to discuss theology and culture and education and the intersections of those things, and to look at current predicaments and challenges and thoughts at the moment, and have good discussions about those. So I've managed to get some pretty big names already. So
Can you say any?
Yeah. So the first episode is Dr. Noreen Hertzfeldt, who is a great thinker on AI and has been for the last 20-ish years or so. She's just delivered a presentation to the Vatican. And then she came on and spoke to me, which, was amazing. So that'll be up first. And then I've also talked to the one, the only Esther Meek, who's written Loving to Know and other big books. She's a very respected theologian and philosopher. So that's really exciting. I've got Nigel Tubbs on, who's friends with Rowan Williams. So that's, he's touching the Holy of Holies. And some other big people too. But I'm very excited to be talking to those guys. We've got another episode coming up a bit later about current ideas around masculinity, and talking to some key researchers and presenters in that field. And a lot of the stuff we've touched on today in terms of some of the more conservative or neoconservative ideas, just discussing, what does that mean for teachers, and particularly female teachers, to feel maybe unsafe in some of those environments. So I think it'll be cool. And
what's the name of it? Is it Makerspace?
Makerspace. Yeah.
There we go. Say it like an American and it comes through.
So Makerspace. Makerspace.
Well, you got to find it on Spotify and iTunes right now, right?
Yeah. So I'll send you the link, and yeah.
Cool. I'll put it in the show notes if anyone is interested in following along with more of what Sam talks about, and as he interviews some of those really impressive people, which is amazing. Thanks for coming along, Sam. Thanks for being a part of this. It's always good. I'm sure we'll have you back after you learn a whole lot more from all these people you've been interviewing, and all of your professional development days on those Friday afternoons in the schools.
All my haircuts,
all the haircuts, everything.
I'm really interested to know how you morph. You've sort of morphed from Jesus to Paul the Apostle, and what will it be next?
I think maybe you, Graham. Maybe I'll morph into you next time.
Heaven forbid,
Maybe
Timothy. Dream.
No, that's good. Thanks a lot, Sam. Thanks for hanging out and Zoom with us.